So another vertical feature that I like to add to my hardscape designs is a seat wall. The clients love this when you provide a backdrop to their space or provide some overflow seating for their guests. Now let's talk about how that also is set right on the open graded base foundation that we have prepped. So once again, we have our open graded stone canvas that we're going to start building this on. One thing you want to keep in mind is the pitch or the drainage that I told you to put on the top of that patio. So if graded out correctly, we're going to have that pitch, it's not going to be that much, but we're going to have an angle coming down that base. We're going to be setting our seat wall block level. So a good rule of thumb is to start those block on the low end of your pitch. So then as you're setting these next block, you may be digging in a little bit, but you can't start at the high spot because then you're going to be adding and eventually your block would be above the pavers you're working with. So like with the steps, we're going to use that 1-inch bedding layer of fluff to level these out and get any inconsistencies out of the 3/4 inch base. So we're going to put in our 1-inch bedding layer, and then we're going to put that 7-inch, 4.5-inch, 5-inch, whatever kind of block you're working with. The first one is going to go on that bedding layer, and you're going to work your way up into your pitch. Then we're simply going to stack up however many blocks it takes. Now our pavers are going to meet the bottom of this. That's the crucial reason that we want this to be built before we start laying the pavers, is that the pavers are going to come up and cover half of that bottom block and give it that custom built-in look. The dimension we're shooting for, once we have a cap on this wall, from here to the top of our pavers is 16 inches to 18 inches. Now, depending on the type of block you're working with, you just add up however many rows you need and add that cap. And that comes from the height of a dining room chair. I had a client call me out on that height. I simply went up to their dining room chair with my tape measure, and most chairs are 16 to 18 inches, hence the seat wall. Another thing I like to keep in mind when I'm laying out these seat walls is where they come into play as far as my border pavers go. If we have a square patio just like this, we have the option to build our seat wall outside of our border, or we could bring that in to our border. But what you don't want to do is when you bring that border around, have it jet out around your seat wall. To me, that just takes away from the clean rectangle shape that we're working with here. So when you're lining up the face of your seat wall, just keep in mind where your border blocks or where your border pavers are going to come into play and how they're going to line up to keep that consistent frame around your hardscape space. So the focus in this lesson is seat walls and how we line them up with our border pavers. You can see here in this design, I was already thinking about how I was going to build this seat wall and how it was going to correlate with the banding line that I have going around. So I want to pay attention to where the face of my seat wall comes into play with my border bricks. Is it inside of there, outside of there, and is it not jet out and give us a goofy line? So let's take a look at how we lay that out in the field and how we keep that concern in mind. So here's a good example, right? Our open graded canvas is prepped. I have it sprayed out. This is just like we left things in week 1. We're then now going to spray out where our vertical elements go. And a good visual for me is knowing exactly where my pavers are going to be and where that seat wall is going to lay. So that this line that I sprayed out represents the face of my seat wall. I know where that comes into play with my border pavers. Now check this out. Here is my fluff that I'm talking about. I'm right on top of my compacted open graded stone canvas. All of my pitch on this patio is going in this direction. So I start on the low end of my grade and I start to work my way into it. One reason I like to set up everything off a radius is it's just a foolproof way to make a perfect curve. So you can see this is a fairly complex design, but what I tried to do within it was make it user-friendly or builder-friendly as I start to lay out these spaces. So this is my method for laying out a perfect radius. I just want to touch on that real quick. This seat wall is built on the same radius as this rug and the same radius as the whole outside perimeter of this patio. I do so by putting my grade stake right in the center, stretching out my tape measure to the measurement that I'm looking for, and making sure that that measurement hits the face of each one of these blocks. Every time a block joins another one, I stretch out my tape and make sure it's hitting that exact increment as I bring this around, inevitably setting me up for a perfect curved seat wall. So let me just point this out. We are building a curved seat wall, and you're never going to get a block that gives you the perfect taper for how you're going to curve that wall. So what we got to do here is take off the difference. On every freestanding wall that is curved, there is going to be some cutting involved, just like there is on a cap scenario on a curved wall. So you can see the gaps right here that are created as we bring that around. So I'll show you guys a little bit later on how I take out that difference, but just keep in mind that when building a curved seat wall, there is going to be some cutting to take off that difference in the back and not have that gap showing when you're done on the back side. So there's my method. I got my saw right there. You got to check everything as you go. My radiuses is what I set first. So all these faces are off of my radius. I then start to slide them over. I have them sitting there though, even though I'm going to take them back up and cut them, because what that does is give me the gap that I need to take off of this other side. So I work my way around there, keeping things level, keeping them on the radius, and setting up for a perfect curve on that seat wall. So once I have them cut, I go back, make sure that they're all level. Here's a great example of why you would not want, of why you need to keep things level. This row is perfectly level as I set, is once this block is set, I put my 2-foot level over onto that block and make sure I'm directly in the middle of that bubble as I work my way around. As I start to bring up that next row, a simple rule or something to keep in mind when you're building a segmental retaining wall is to offset those seams or those joints in the block. You can see here, we're working with, we got this block in, this block in, this block in. When I go to set my next row on there, I'm starting it halfway in between to ensure that these seams are staggered throughout. That's going to provide the strength that we need when we're building a freestanding wall. I just want to point out a way that I took this wall to the next level is just by bringing in another block of a different tone or texture. Really just adds some distinction, breaks up that pattern and that tone of that other block that we're working with, and just adds a little bit of distinction. On this particular job, I put that banding layer in there in the bar, and I also put that in there in the fire pit. We'll take a look at that later. So every block is cut when you're building a freestanding wall on a curved radius. And you always want to make sure you dry fit the whole row. This whole course is cut and set on there before I even get out my adhesive. It's almost like a mock-up just to making sure everything looks good before I make it permanent. Now I start to bring in that next block. This is my accent band. I start to bring in my next block. I still want to keep in mind that these seams are offset. You never want those to line up. If you can't get out of that and something starts to line up, put a cut in your wall just to keep that seam offset.